right, hello everybody. Welcome back. It's September the 25th. We are into Libra season, and we are also just heading into the eclipse season where we are going to have a lunar eclipse in Aries and a solar eclipse in Libra. And I was trying to basically come up with my divination of how to interpret this Libra solar eclipse that is coming up. And I started thinking, I've been doing this astrology stuff for long enough now that I can just think of people with Sun in Libra off the top of my head, famous Librans. And I was looking around at the charts of different famous Librans, and something just came together really quick. And now, I mentioned in my last video that I'm trying not to be so political, and by starting this off with Margaret Thatcher, somebody who is probably one of the most despised and hated politicians in the history of politics, the Iron Lady of the 80s or whatever, one of the introducers of neoliberalism. People have even made a Doom game about Margaret Thatcher in hell or something like that, like a mod for Doom. But honestly, I'm not here to do a political commentary. I'm not There's probably a lot. If people want to understand why people don't like Margaret Thatcher, there are probably other YouTubers who have done very thorough work and videos laying out all the problems with Thatcherism and stuff like this. So that's not really what I'm here to do, but I am trying to understand the dynamic that's happening around a solar eclipse in Libra. And I'm going to pull up Margaret Thatcher's chart, and I'll show you what I find striking about this. That if you notice here that right now the sun is in Libra with Mars in Libra, and Margaret Thatcher has the three planets Sun, Mars, and Mercury in Libra. And not only that, but we also have, as an influence in this current dynamic, we have Chiron in Aries. And I don't talk about Chiron as much. I tend to focus on the 10 planets that people normally use in astrology. I don't get into the dwarf planets or the asteroids as much, but it's included on this chart. And I do know that Chiron is in Aries. So there's something about this which seemed particularly resonant, right? And when I think about the dynamic between Libra and Aries, I often think about how Aries is associated with a principle of individualism. It's a Mars ruled sign. Mars is a masculine planet that has to do with separating and individuating and all this kind of stuff. And if you use the 12-letter alphabet, it's the first sign of the zodiac. If you start the astrological new year in spring, then Aries comes first. And often, even if you read the ancient astrologers, they talk about the ram as being like a kind of a childlike baby, or like the kind of first kind of youthful energy of spring, kind of the singular kind of initiating principle that comes from a cardinal sign. And then Libra is often contrasted with Aries by being about kind of like the relational contract or the social contract, right? In that you are balancing self with other, the needs of the individual and the needs of society and such, which brings me basically when I'm thinking about Thatcher, one of the first things that comes to mind is the famous Thatcherism that Margaret Thatcher once said, there is no such thing as society. That basically, to paraphrase, that we are all individuals, and that society is a kind of an illusion that happens as a result of all these different individuals doing their own thing, right? And one of the things, this principle or this ideology came to be a kind of a basis of what was called neoliberalism, or some might see Thatcher as being more of like a neoconservatism. But the principle of independence. I mean, you can also see this as being a kind of a thread in Carl Jung's thought with his emphasis on individuation, right? That Carl Jung thought that society itself was comprised by separate individuals, and that if the individuals aren't strong, then society isn't strong. So it's up to sort of foster the strength of the individual. And in this sense, it's a sharp contrast between, let's say, politicians like Roosevelt, who did things like the New Deal, where there was to try to deal with the Great Depression and all this unemployment. They created great social programs to try to get people employed and to help out poor people. And in contrast to this, Thatcher is very much like the introduced the sort of era of politics that was like the only thing that a politician really does is cut taxes, cut spending, and this idea that a bloated government bureaucracy is no good, and that you have to strip down the government to be as efficient as possible, and not helping anybody out, but rather encouraging a kind of an independent sort of entrepreneurship, right? And so and this kind of attitude, I think, this is what I'm thinking about with the North Node in Aries and the South Node in Libra, is that Libra, if anything, is about making a kind of a balance between the self and the other. But what happens when you have Mars, the planet of Aries, which is all about this sort of like, assertive, independent, individualistic kind of thing in Libra, is that you have a kind of in this case, you have a person who is in a position of great political authority and power, making cuts to all the government programs, making cuts to basically saying like there is no such thing as society. There is like it's all a bunch of individuals, dog eat, like that kind of dog eat dog capitalism. And that even this goes with this whole thing about privatizing things like healthcare, and all the national industries are now privatized in the name of this sort of rugged individualism, right? And you can see this kind of in the dynamic of Thatcher's chart with this Mars and Sun in Libra. To remind you that Libra is a Venus sign that Mars does not do well with, but there's maybe a bit of irony though, because I think traditional dignities always work out in a very plain way, where just good dignity means better. But there are some things non-related to the sign of Libra here that I thought was also interesting, namely that Thatcher has Sun conjunct Neptune. And like in my last videos, I was talking about Neptune in terms of either religion or politics, and that even regardless of what ideology you adopt, there's something about political ideology that is almost kind of like a religion. Or if you take this thing like that there is no such thing as society, and the real truth is this sort of rugged individualism, and you really it's kind of, if you see the moon and Neptune, it's kind of like that could be kind of like your own opiate of the masses. That could be your own kind of belief system, your own ideology, that you're kind of believing a fairy tale rather than being firmly grounded in reality, right? And you can also notice she's got a perfect opposition between Jupiter and Capricorn. Not, again, this is a very, not where Jupiter likes to be. Jupiter has poor dignity, is in its fall in Capricorn, opposed by Pluto in Cancer, which I thought was interesting. And there could be something about like Cancer is about the family, and Capricorn, so Jupiter and Capricorn maybe has a kind of materialistic working class kind of vibe, and the opposition of neoliberals, neoconservatives, and the working class. I don't know. There might be something in there for people who are more politically adept, may be able to see something of resonant value in this perfect opposition there. But I'm going to move on and not get too hung up on Thatcher right now. My next person is this guy, Michel Foucault. You may have heard of him. He is commonly sort of tarred and feathered or cast down by people of a certain political persuasion as being one of the worst of the postmodernists. Like Jordan Peterson hates this guy. However, there's something, I'm just not gonna, I don't want to spend too much time on Foucault, but I probably will anyways, that there's, in the era of the last few years, I have just noted that there's some kind of great irony in the whole political landscape, because especially, let's look at one specific issue, the thing to do with vaccine politics and COVID-19 politics in general. That Foucault was very famous for talking about a certain idea which he defined as biopower, right? And one of the things that I think sort of upset a lot of people these last few years was that if you were a working class guy, like the Canadian truckers who went on protest and stuff like that, you may be shocked to realize that, to have the sense that your body, your own bodily autonomy, is not really your own, and it's like your body is the property of the state, right? But the thing is, when it comes to vaccine politics, that even, regardless of the efficacy of vaccines, I'm not making any claim about them one way or the other, whether they're good or bad, or they work or they don't work, or you should get them or you shouldn't get them. But whether or not, if you look at whether or not people have the right to choose whether they use this medical technology or not, whether they accept this substance into their body or not, in the case of vaccine, you kind of, like, a lot of people had their you're backed up against a wall, in a sense, that if maybe their jobs depended on it, right? Or that they would have to switch jobs or something. But at least at the end of the day, you had a choice whether you had this medication. Well, it's not really a medication, it's a vaccine, right? But whether you had this or not, you had a choice. But then that choice would have a great impact on your status of employment and what kind of a life you were living. And that I have to say honestly that part of why I got into Foucault has to do with my history of being involved with, let's say, the anti-psychiatry movement, or the radical mental health movement. Is that I went through something where, for a number of years I was on an antipsychotic medication, and I was not given any choice whatever about, like, whether I wanted to be on this medication, right? And Michel Foucault wrote a book. One of his first book that he wrote was called Madness and Civilization. Um, and it's a great book. It's a fairly long, but there's an audiobook copy of it on YouTube that has a guy with an Irish accent reading it in a kind of an amusing voice that makes it kind of like, even if you get bored of the content, the delivery is great. But the thing about Michel Foucault is that I think when he was fairly young, he must have had a run-in with psychiatry, or he was dealing with his own mental health stuff. And Foucault, just to be straight up, he was he was gay. He was a kind of like a discontent, like a person who was upset with the status quo, or upset with the way things were, and his had a certain style that was kind of very rebellious and stuff like this. But one of the things that Foucault points out is this whole thing about, he also went, probably his most famous work was Discipline and Punish, all about prisons and how the school, the hospital, the army all kind of resemble this sort of structure of, like, being in a prison where you're controlled and disciplined and all this kind of stuff. And for me, it's like coming to mind because I'm taking a course right now, and that's all about AI and computers and the problem of what Deleuze called a control society. And Deleuze basically made this, he was saying that we were moving away from the society of discipline that Foucault talked about, and that we're moving on to a society of control. And this goes with the whole conversation of Margaret Thatcher and the kind of like the rugged individualism, is that rather than being in a situation where you were basically had to, go in, punch a clock, and if you were late, you're punished. You have to do everything your boss tells you, or else you're controlled by the system of punishment. And having, and even this whole thing about controlling, you have to have you have to get to work on time, punch the clock, be in a certain space, and then you're only given a 15-minute break. These are all those things that are considered normal in the workforce, but this is essentially a kind of the human body being property of the state. Your body isn't yours to do what you want, and if you do things like take a longer lunch break, you'll lose your job, right? And this is the same basic principle of, like, you think you have free choice of what if you take a vaccine or not, and all that. And nobody, from Foucault's point of view, nobody was talking about this, so he thought it was very urgent that he had to talk about this kind of stuff. But what I find so interesting is that in the midst of this whole political situation where there is a lot of people concerned about this, Foucault was basically dismissed as being a pervert based on some rumor that maybe like something might have happened, but with like little kids or something like that. And people often dismiss a lot of these French intellectuals in that way, right? And I find this incredibly kind of ironic, because there's this whole conversation going around where people are sick of cancel culture. They're sick of people, this sort of like being this kind of alarmist moralism, or like if somebody doesn't have a completely spotless record, you have to throw their whole contribution to different ideas and our culture out. But I think there's actually, people may have a very strong vested interest to make sure that people don't take Michel Foucault seriously, because I have basically been kind of wondering why there's like all these people who they, like, if they could maybe be a bit more literate or a bit more sophisticated about the kind of complaints they made, if they realized that these were the kinds of topics that are being dismissed as Marxist postmodernism, or like this kind of intellectuals, the intelligentsia, these kind of like uptight literate people who are snobs, who are against the working class, and all this kind of. And it's like, if you actually guys read this stuff, you may realize that they agree with you more than you may think, right? But I just thought I would throw Michel. There's something about Michel Foucault that if you remember how Thatcher had Mars, Mercury, and the Sun in Libra, here you see that Michel Foucault has Venus in Libra. Venus is the ruler of Libra. So it's kind of funny, because if you go by this kind of like approach of looking at astrological dignities, you've got Thatcher, who was somebody who basically didn't care for the social contract at all. It was basically trying to create a system where the government doesn't owe you shit, and it's every man for himself in this kind of brutal dog eat dog kind of way, right? Not gonna help the poor people out, not gonna help the disenfranchised people out. Maybe if a certain strain of politics you really like that kind of stuff. Michel Foucault, on the other hand, was, I mean, no wonder he's like, and it's kind of funny that Thatcher and Foucault are both 12th housers here. Like, they both have the Saturn in Scorpio, and they both have the Sun in the 12th house. And then Foucault writing all about prisons and all this kind of stuff, but like Thatcher being more like the prison warden, if anything, right? Like the person who's running the show. But there's something about Venus here, that Venus wants to harmonize and mediate and bring, like, Libra's all about balance, right? So in some way, Venus in Libra is good for harmonizing and bringing balance, or trying to be a voice for, what's the other side of the position that's not being heard, right? Whereas, well, I don't know if I want to labor this point or any too much, but I thought it was interesting anyways, the contrast between the Mars in Libra and the Venus in Libra, and how it fits in with the overall, like, Libra belonging to this thing of what is the social contract? What do we owe society? Are we just here to be kind of selfish individuals who are out for our own skin, or do we owe our neighbors, our community, our society any consideration, right? And that you can maybe see the undertones with some of the vaccine politics, or there's also this kind of thing is like how our own our bodies are conditioned, or how our way of how we relate to being a human with a body in an environment, and how we're supposed to spend our time is so heavily conditioned by these systems of control that we feel guilty if we're like, people are like, oh, I'm so lazy, I didn't get anything done today, because we've had it hammered into us that we need to be working nonstop all the time, right? Because if we don't, you know, the society is not going to help us, right? Society doesn't give a shit, or at least a Thatcherite society doesn't give a shit, right? Um, the next up is R.D. Laing, and maybe I have this sort of sense about R.D. Laing that it fits into this conversation, this trend, like I was talking about with Foucault, was talking about a disciplinary society, and the society of enclosure, and Laing marked this pivotal change where up Laing was around at the time when people with mental health problems were largely just kept in asylums, right? And I personally am concerned because this is one thing that I have basically spent a few years being involved in the anti-psychiatry scene, a few years being involved in the radical mental health scene and all this stuff like that. But I hit this wall where I was feeling incredibly dismayed because I felt like nobody could really understand where I was coming from, or at least my position was completely seemed to be completely irrelevant based on the actual situation which was playing out, right? And what I'm talking about is that people look at people look at people who are living on the streets with addictions or involved with crime, and that in BC here we have what is called a housing first policy, right? That rather than trying to focus first on trying to get everybody off drugs or trying to get everybody, you know, cleaned up or whatever, that oftentimes people are using drugs to cope with this messed up situation they're in. And if you can give people the sense of security or stability, that they at least have a roof over their heads, that they at least have a home, that they at least have housing, a place to go, then that in itself kind of takes a lot of the edge off, or the what drives people to use drugs, which drives people into committing criminal acts and stuff like that. And yet, so I think this is probably a good idea, but when I was, when I would like go on Facebook and see what people were saying in the local communities and stuff, people basically saying, we need to bring asylums back, we need to lock everybody up. And these are the same people that in the next breath will tell you about how much they love freedom, right? We're freedom lovers, we don't want the man coming and infringing on our freedom. But what do you do with the guy on the street? Oh, you lock the fucker up. It's like, oh my God. And so I basically have given up on that. I mean, there's no reasoning with people, because people are basically locked into this kind of thing that if the people who are not doing well in life, we don't owe them shit. Those people can just die for all we care. And it's up to you to be a strong individual and all this kind of stuff, right? Now, why am I talking about R.D. Laing here? So like R.D. Laing, one of the things that R.D. Laing did that was so revolutionary was that he started rather than having this system where you had people that were stuck in asylums for their whole lives, treated as non-human objects, basically, he basically was famous for creating his own kind of not was asylum, he called it Kingsley Hall, where you would have people with mental health problems, but instead of treating them as objects, treating them as non-human, subhuman people because they could not achieve this, the same state of humanhood as you're going to work and being a person and all this kind of stuff. That he had a house where people could just be people and not objectify, and everybody would be treated as equals. You wouldn't have this division between I'm the doctor, you're the person with a problem, and this eventually gave way. Like, he was a major force in this push to basically deinstitutionalize everything, get people out of the asylums, get people back into society. But then we're kind of in this moment where a lot of people are wondering whether this or not this was a good idea. And like I said, people are actually, like, Donald Trump was getting on this. Like, Donald Trump was saying we have to build more build more hospital, or like almost these asylums that are almost more like prisons, basically, which is going like not this is which is kind of weird because it's going backwards to a more disciplinary society, right? Um, there's something else about Artie Lang, in that Artie Lang, I have to also admit that he, with this whole thing about Libra, right? What I was saying is that Libra, I'm interpreting Libra as having something to do with the balance between self and other, whether that is looking at yourself as a member of a community, as a member of a family, as a member of a society. Um, and I have to admit that Artie Lang does not have the best reputation. He did write a great book called Madness, Sanity, and the Family. That was all. And one of the things, I mean, rather than getting too complicated, one of the things I appreciate about Artie Lang is that rather than we have this way of looking at mental health diagnosis where you have a bunch of discrete individual people, right? And that each person has their own individual discrete diagnosis. And that is looked at without any respect to context of the broader social situation, what or seeing different problems arising in a situational context, right? And there's this whole idea that, like, if you take something out of context, you don't really understand the significance of it, because it's like, you know what I mean? Like, it would be like taking a song from the 1960s that was all about like the psychedelic revolution and taking it completely out of historical context and just presenting it beside Beethoven or something like that, and just as if they were just neutral pieces of music, which you can't, like, you have to, if you're understanding a person and their problems, you have to kind of look at the social situation that the problem is coming up in, the cultural situation that the problem is coming. And this isn't the same thing as blaming it on society, but looking at rather than looking at a problem as one person and it's their problem and it's something wrong with that person, you can see it as a relational problem, something that, like, problems that come up in relationship, right? And of course, this completely fell out of favor once Margaret Thatcher got in, because, as Margaret Thatcher says, there's no such thing as society, right? And that it kind of introduced this new system where, instead of focusing on relationships, instead of focusing on talk therapy, there, there the Thatcher neoliberal era gave way to this era where everything could now just be handled with medications, and that, looking at the relationship dynamics were kind of troublesome and upset people. So we don't just forget about that. Take some Prozac, focus on trying to make your entrepreneurial business a success, and feel positive, because if you feel good, then you'll be more motivated to be a productive force for the economy, right? Whereas, like, Artie Lang, I have to admit, though, that Artie Lang, for all his insights about this relational stuff, apparently he was a huge asshole to his family. And there's this problem where one of his young daughters got sick with a bad disease, and people were kind of blaming him for causing all this drama in his own family, to the point where his own kids were getting sick, and he was writing this book about how he had so much insight into relational stuff. And meanwhile, but this is the whole thing about, like, the thing about cancel culture, or the thing about, like, we can admit that this guy was, of course, this guy was not very perfect. This guy did not have a spotless reputation by any means. But I mean, and it doesn't. He still has a valuable contribution in my mind, anyways, right? But that, um, and then this, like, to remind you that right now, if you're understanding the astrological dynamics of this moment, that we have this Mars in Libra with the Sun in Libra, and is it some kind of weird irony that both Artie Lang and Margaret Thatcher have this same astrological signature, even though they politically are very different, but they are both pivotal characters in the changes that happened around the beginning of the 1980s, right? Artie Lang was more active in the 60s, but he led to this whole change where instead of having people locked up in asylums, now you had people who were free to be members of the society, but they now had were forced by legal measures to have medications in their bodies whether or not they wanted them, right? That this whole thing that rather you don't need to be in a prison if the government owns your body and basically controls what you do with your body, what you put in your body, what you don't put in your body, you know. And that so there's this whole thing where we don't, you know. And also you can also spin this whole thing where the prison is not necessarily there for discipline anymore, but the prison itself has become a business, right? um it's not to say that the prisons and the disciplinary society, the discipline stuff, has disappeared completely. um but I don't know, there's something about that. But this issue though, about even about how we deal with issues of law and punishment and justice, that Libra is the balance. Libra is associated with the tarot card justice. The scales are like the justice scales. That is what. And so there's this issue of like, there's you as an individual, and then how do you keep that your needs and your pursuits, the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of individuation, this pursuit of independence, having your own agency and autonomy in society, versus how you get along with your family, your community, your the people that are in your life? Or are those people completely absent, and do we live in a place that's not a society, that it's just a bunch of individuals, and individuals can do what they want, and it's only the power of force, basically, right? That we are all just a bunch of rugged individuals at battle with each other, and it's just brute force against brute force to see what we make is right, you know? And I think there's something about this is how I am interpreting the astrological dynamics with the eclipses in Libra and Aries. Um, Hopefully you like this video. Thank you very much.